I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life.
And that if you were to replace those people with robots, though some other people who weren't getting served very well might now get served a little bit better, it's still gonna suck. So if, for instance, you need people to care for you, having a real human being with a nurturing heart caring for you makes a really big difference, right? As opposed to a person who just kind of comes in and checks your temperature and then leaves and doesn't really have like a human moment with you, doesn't really know anything about you or really care, right? And of course, nowadays, nurses are the most overworked, especially in med school, right? I talked to a med school student. She said, I think we're all being turned into Nazis, right? And what she meant was like, we're being turned into bureaucratic instruments, almost punitive, like soldiers who just come in and get the thing done. And because we're so overworked, we're not able to actually have a more quality kind of time with people, right? Now, that's not always the case, and there are exceptional med school programs. Like I think Duquesne University tries to be different. And that's part of the reason why they make their nurses read Levinas. You know, like they're trying to get you to realize there's something beyond the totalization and instrumentalization and reduction of this system, right? But for the most part, this is a problem, right? Well, one of the things that Nietzsche says about otium, he says the aristocracy always had two fundamental principles or concerns, and that was otium and bellum. Right? Otium is active leisure, bellum is war. Active leisure and war. And of course, the reason that war even matters, sure, you can get some glory and maybe a title from whoever's in power, but beyond that, the real fruit of war can mean active leisure time, right? And that's what it meant for Romans in the Roman Empire. Glory and leisure. And that's why snobs of old, prior to the bourgeoisie, prior to the rise of the bourgeoisie during the bourgeois revolutions, the old aristocracy was extremely condescending towards labor, right? I mean, in ancient Athens, if you had done stuff like work or selling things in the market, I think you had to wait 15 years before you were able to enter the Lyceum and engage in politics. You had to like cleanse yourself of all that and get into a different kind of headspace, right? Well, I'm not saying I want to go back to that kind of world, but I do really want to drive home this point about time energy, because while we could think about it at the level of our families becoming alienated to each other, right? Because we might have money and we might not have money, but ultimately we don't have the time and the energy. When we have time, we don't have energy, we are exhausted, right? And when we do have energy, it's not with repeatable, reliable, socially available kinds of time, right? So you have energy today, but it's not going to be reliable, right? Because this is just like a freak occurrence, having some energy outside of work. But then if you really tried to change things and you really wanted to go beyond folk politics, which is what Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams in their book about the future, is it called Inventing the Future? I think so. They talk about folk politics as being one of the problems with the left. And of course, they are left accelerationists. They are interested in as am I, large-scale structural change. They're thinking about longer-term, serious, future-oriented kinds of social change. And they're kind of like, hey, guys, this folk politics thing, it's not really working. So what do they mean by folk politics? They're talking about when people really want to change the world, and so then they get together in a group of 5 to 25 people, and then they sit around and they talk about things, and they talk and they talk and they talk and they talk and they talk, and then they all come out with super, super sophisticated opinions about how everybody else should act and about what is or is not righteous, reasonable, or stupid. But ultimately, nothing that they're doing there trickles out into the broader culture in any way that has a serious possibility of large-scale structural change. And I would then add, and I don't think they really go there, but most of the ways that social change does trickle out from those spaces is a way that drives on popular resentment against those people who usually either have liberal arts degrees or spent too much time following influencers who either do or were aping people who do, right? And so this is where you get the sort of, you know, the excesses of identity politics, of gender activism, of disability activism, all very important things that get easily hijacked by folk political virtue hoarding, which is a term that Catherine Liu uses for what the PMC is ultimately doing in her book, Virtue Hoarders. And so that brings us here to the PMC, because if we're thinking about the problems with activism, I want to start with the second one, the PMC. Nod your head if you are already pretty familiar with that term. I can't read the chat if anybody's talking to me, by the way. I can see it goes off, but it's too far away for me to see. But virtue hoarding for Catherine Liu is when you have relative privilege, and you know you do, right? And you probably feel bad about it, and you probably try to do something about that politically, or at least you talk about it. You try to be self-aware about it, as most progressives are. But you end up with that relative privilege spending a lot of time cultivating super sophisticated opinions about what the right way of child rearing is, or what the right way of dressing might be, or what the right way of eating is, right? And none of this is politics for her, right? And I admire her ability to critique this. She's actually a great polemicist, right? But the crisis of the PMC goes much deeper, I've discovered, through reading people like John Taylor Gatto, whose work, Weapons of Mass Instruction, made me aware that progressive education, the kind that is universal and coerced and age segregated en masse, that approach to education, though it had noble goals of bringing literacy to everybody, also had explicitly anti-working class goals as well, right? And so we're talking about President Woodrow Wilson, the first progressive, the one who invaded Soviet Russia in 1918 with the Allies, right? One of the things that we don't usually learn about. The Woodrow Wilson was in bed with the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, who back then was, you know, those guys were like Elon Musk and Bezos today, except that nowadays there's over 1,000 billionaires existing. Back then there were not so many, right? They were big sharks in a very small pool compared to Bezos and Musk, right? And so Carnegie and Rockefeller, like these guys and their education institutes, were very pro-education as well, but they wanted a specific kind of education that was a bit more scientific. And that's where Frederick Winslow Taylor comes in with his principles of scientific management, in which he is explicit as well about how this approach to management must make harmony between the good workers and the bosses, right? You got to get rid of the bad workers. the ones who want to organize, the ones who want to, start unions and whatnot. We gotta cultivate an education system that is going to get out ahead of that kind of working class organizing. And Woodrow Wilson, I think in 1915, something like that. I have it in my book, but just off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact year, but it's right around then, right? There's all this labor unrest. And he says when he was the president of the Ivy League university he was at the time, he said, we want two kinds of children. We want one kind that can lead and the other kind that can follow. And the kind that can lead is going to, by necessity, have to be very, very small. Right? This is where you're thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois's The Talented Tenth, another great work of progressive early 20th century America, right? The idea being we need a talented tenth, and he says of every race, but ultimately we need a talented tenth to be able to uplift and guide and control the lower 90%. And the education system should be such that it teaches that 90% who they are and what they deserve and kind of what lane to stay in. And so I'm not one of these people who's anti-scientific management, and I'm not anti-management, and I'm also not anti-professional, and I'm definitely not anti-PMC. And I hope that everybody here gets a cushy PMC job. Like that's not the point. The point is simply to understand the education system as PMC schooling. So it's not just schooling like, oh, you learned things. It's also disciplining the mass to teach us and sort of habituate us to a certain idea of meritocracy, right? Once again, one of those words that doesn't necessarily have to be bad. People getting things on the basis of merit is not necessarily always bad. The issue is with a system where because you were sitting in the front of class and you were, for some strange reason, able to focus on all of these different subjects out of their context and out of any sort of practical application, and then you were able to get things done up against deadlines, all of the things that go into that, it cuts you out to be the top of your class, and now you think that that makes you a better kind of person and that you actually should be leading, right? The problem with that, the main problem with that, because it does have some grain of truth to it, but the main problem with it is that it replaced the advanced workers. Advanced workers were a thing. And so the proletariat, before it was hollowed out and then dispersed across the globe, the proletariat used to have advanced workers who had done everything in the factory and had built the social and cultural capital that they could then use to organize people when it came down to it if they needed to, right? But what Barbara Ehrenreich, in her piece with her husband called The Professional-Managerial Class, what she says is that the capitalists realized that it's a lot more expensive to pay Pinkertons to come in and beat up striking workers than it is to just pay for better management. And it was people like Frederick Winslow Taylor and Edward Bernays who were kind of crafting entire new disciplines, entire new approaches to not just the management within workplaces, but also the managements of public consciousness. That's where Bernays comes in with propaganda, right? These are books that are written in an almost conspiratorial register where they're saying, hey, we can control people. Capital, we can control people and we can get out ahead of these strikes. We can bust the unions before they even form. And they were very openly loud about this kind of thing. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that there is this part of me that's a little skeptical. Maybe they were kind of overselling the case just because they wanted the kind of job that they had. Like Edward Bernays, because of the clout and sort of sign value his name had achieved, he was able to be on a $100,000 a year retainer with Columbia Rope Factory, right? Like that's a profound thing. In a world where everybody else is fighting for a job, he created a whole new job called public relations expert. And now all of a sudden he's a consultant for a rope company getting more money per year than the president of that company. And so part of the story of the PMC, the early progressive PMC, is not just a story of selling the idea of getting out ahead of labor organizing, preempting and undermining it to capitalists. It's also the idea of selling those capitalists on the idea that this is a real function that is needed. And to some extent, well, and to every extent, wherever it actually occurs, something that the working class was organically already doing was then displaced by somebody who had to go to college to get a degree to now do that thing. And one of the other areas Barbara Ehrenreich goes into to talk about this is like nurses and midwives, right? Nurses and midwives, these are traditionally roles that women are able to do. They might feel called to do. It didn't require going to college, and they were able to do it just fine in the working class. And now all of a sudden, working class women aren't allowed to practice these things, right? There's all kinds of penalties, legal restrictions, red tape, etc.